All right. First off, I want to say thanks so much, Tony, for the opportunity to present this paper. It's really helpful to get everyone's feedback here. And so this paper is co-authored with Lakshmi, who's joining LBS this year, and Varun Sharma, who's an excellent PhD candidate. So look for him in the next year or so. Also want to thank Matt for facilitating our discussion. He's already provided some great comments in the Slack channel. We hope to address them in the presentation. I also think it's really interesting the positioning of the paper right after Pat and Ian's paper, just because we get a holistic view of both indirect and direct effects of activist investing and its role on the environmental impact of these companies. So we think of environmental activist investing involving shareholders engaging board members with the primary goal of improving corporate environmental behaviors. And while there's an increased interest in environmental activist investing, to this point, there's a big gap in our understanding about if at all there are any real effects. So on one hand, very mature literature studying how activist investors can affect the financial decisions of firms, operations, innovation, you name it, all in an effort to maximize or increase pecuniary benefits. And on the other side, there's this burgeoning literature looking at social responsible investing, and typically characterized by active divestment campaigns. And kind of between these two, there's an important gap in our understanding about the willingness and also the ability of these activist shareholders to bring about real changes, primarily along the non-pecuniary changes for the environmental impact of these firms. And so in this paper, we asked that question: does environmental activism have any real effects on these firms? And if so, what are the implications for the local economies around them, and also the financial impacts for these firms as well? So in this paper, we study the effect of activist investors on these firms, and have three key results here. The first one is that we show that firms are responding by improving their corporate environmental at the plant level. You see a reduction in total toxic releases, those coming from stack air emissions and greenhouse gases. Seeing these improvements at the plant level, we asked the obvious question: are there improvements in the local economies where these targeted plants exist? And so what we find is that there's a reduction in the cancer-causing pollutants related primarily to respiratory illnesses. We verified this by the effects by looking at air quality monitors within a 1 mile radius around the plants that are being targeted, and see an important drop in criteria gases around the plants. And then finally, we also tried measuring or quantifying the intensity of pollution. So considering both the population, the dosage, and also the toxicity of the chemicals that are being reduced, and studied the census block group level around these plants, and also find a lower intensity of pollution around these plants. Now, the last obvious question you'd want to ask is, well, how are these firms actually achieving this? So what we do is we study the steps that these plants are taking and find that they're primarily reducing the waste generated through production rather than shifting to recycling and other treatment activities. And when we start looking at the pollution prevention data, we find they're primarily taking preventative efforts and also undertaking new inventory controls to help with reducing their pollution, at least in the short run. And kind of interpreting all these results, we take them all together. It seems that investors are able to delegate their pro-social preferences onto firms to bring about real changes in their corporate environmental behaviors. So I think it's important, let's just jump right into this. In our setting, we studied the New York City pension system that publicly announced the Boardroom Accountability Project in November 2014. And what they did is they started submitting proxy access proposals to portfolio companies that they felt were deficient along very specific sustainability mandates. So they began submitting without announcement in a staggered fashion over several years these proxy access proposals to specific firms within their portfolio. And within these pro-social mandates, there were three key mandates that they were focusing on: either excess CEO pay, board diversity, or what we study in our paper, climate change risk. And so as you see in the quote here, especially when it comes to the environment, business as usual is no longer an option. So this is a really important mandate that they were interested in. And so these activist campaigns were credible threats that the board members were unable to ignore. The reasons that while it was led by the New York City pension system through the Boardroom Accountability Project, 3 of the 4 largest US pension funds were backing this campaign. They were very well coordinated, both their communication with the board members and also the attendance in the annual general meetings. And they're credible threats to the actual board members themselves. And so it was something that they were clearly responding to and were interested in. Now, in studying this, it's important for us to understand how in the world are these companies being targeted. So we did the obvious thing. We picked up the phone and called the New York City city's controller's office. So we had multiple calls with the assistant controller. We subsequently submitted FOIA requests, analyzed their data that we received from them, and it was all confirmed that they were targeting firms based off of a private list that they acquired called the Fossil Free Index. This is a list that's generated to measure the carbon in place, or you think of pollution potential of firms globally. And what they did is they just went down the list, selected firms near the top and said, okay, we're going to use these and kind of keep going down. So to verify that, what we do is we run a multivariate logistic regression. The x-axis over here is the coefficient of interest. The y-axis over here are characteristics that we want to test. And what you find, interestingly, is that firms that are large and firms that are on the fossil fuel list primarily predicted being targeted. Interesting, when we look at environmental scores or kind of how are they polluting, seem not to predict targeting by the Boardroom Accountability Project. So it seems like it was really relying on them being on the list, not necessarily their pollutive activities or how much they're actually polluting, just their polluting potential. So being such a strong predictor, the fossil fuel list, one concern that one might have, and Matt, I think, brought this up a little bit, was, well, maybe the Boardroom Accountability Project were selecting firms primarily because they were already in the process of improving. And if that was the case, we'd be misinterpreting our results, that the Boardroom Accountability Project was able just to select firms that were already mean reverting or in the process of improving. So what we did is we coded up the total carbon reserves for plants, that's your for the firms on your x-axis, and the pre-targeting change in toxic releases on the y-axis over here. What you show here is that there seems to be a near zero relationship between how much carbon in place you have and the pre-improvements of these firms. So it seems like these firms in aggregate are not improving their total toxic releases being pre-targeted. So it also gives us at least alleviates some concerns that the results are driven by the carbon reserves in place. And so using an approach similar to other papers in the activism literature, we use difference in differences propensity score matching specification. The key variable of interest here is our beta 2. It's the interactive term between our post and environment indicators. And what we're studying here, what we're trying to study here are within plant changes. And so our counterfactual firms come from the Russell 3000, which is similar to the portfolio of the New York City pension system. And we match using French 12 industry codes and other important covariates that are suggested by our analysis. So just to fix ideas here, I think it's important to make it clear here. What we're comparing are between targeted and control firms. On the left-hand side are a sample of targeted firms from the BAP, whereas on the right-hand side are the equivalent control firms that we're comparing against. So that the key thought experiment is we're comparing between companies such as Chevron against Marathon Petroleum, both large, well-integrated oil companies. And so to accomplish this, it was a big data effort, big kind of to incorporate kind of all the analysis that we're going to show here. The first one is primarily coming from the Boardroom Accountability Project and all the data we got from the pension system. The second one was from a set of databases from the EPA. And the third set of analysis were from either traditional or non-traditional data sets listed below. So if there's one picture or one figure you want to take away from our presentation, this is it. So what this shows is the improvement between treated and control plants from the targeting of firms. So on the x-axis over here, you'll see event time in years. It's normalized to t-1. The dependent variable is the log of total toxic releases. It's unscaled. And the treatment treatment plants are the blue circles, whereas the controls are your red triangles. And so there's three key ideas you want to take out of this. First, if you look in the pre-period, it seems like both the treat and control firms are moving in parallel, which is important. The second point that you want to take away is that the control firms seem to be precisely zero, not changing from their total toxic releases through time. And the third one, you see a persistent improvement in treated firms. So you see a persistent improvement in these as well. So at least gives us, at first blush, seems like there's improvements coming or accruing to these treated plants. Now, if we move to a more formal regression setting here, what we do is our dependent variable changes. What we look at is the log total releases divided by inputs, our lagged COGS. And we do this for a main reason that if we see a reduction in total releases, it could be driven by a firm actually improving its total toxic releases, or it could be that the firm is just reducing its output and that we would be mistaking our inference and saying that they're just improving, but in fact, they're reducing their total output. And so this specification is robust without scaling, but I think this is our preferred specification here. So you want to focus on the first column over here, and particularly the interactive term, which you find here is both a statistically significant and large reduction in total toxic releases within plant. So if you're interpreting this relative to the sample mean, you find roughly a 20% reduction in total toxic releases related to directly targeting firms based off of their environmental impact. When we look between on-site and off-site changes in reductions, we find that firms are primarily reducing those coming from on-site, those where the emissions are being produced, but we also find some off-site as well. Now, the question is, we see a total release in total toxic releases. The question is, what medium is it coming from? Is it coming from land, sea, air? What is the source of these reductions? So we decompose our results to see kind of where these improvements are coming from. We see that they're overwhelmingly coming from stack air emissions. So stack air emissions are from combustion or controlled releases, those through boilers. Those are through, you can think of chimneys. Whereas if you look at fugitive air, think of leaks or pipes that are uncontrolled releases of gases, or surface water discharge does not seem to be driving our main results. So the Boardroom Accountability Project was primarily focused on, had a mandate of considering firms related to climate change risk. So the question begs, are these firms also reducing their gases related to global warming? So what we do is we change our data sets and start looking at the greenhouse gas reporting program to understand the reductions in greenhouse gases. And what we find here is that plants of targeted firms are also reducing their total amount of greenhouse gas emissions. This is roughly translates to a 24% reduction in relative to the sample mean. When we start decomposing into particular chemicals that are driving this, we find that there's a reduction both in carbon dioxide and methane, two of the most lethal greenhouse gases as classified by the EPA. So it seems like you see these really important reductions. So let's take stock here. You see a reduction in total toxic releases, those from stack air emissions, and those of greenhouse gases. So it begs the obvious question: are there improvements in the local economies where these plants are located? So first to do this, what we do is we look at we use the integrated risk information system to help characterize the hazards of these chemicals that are being released. What we find here is that the cancer-causing chemicals related to cancer-causing illnesses associated with respiratory diseases are strongly reducing. So you see primarily our main results are driven by chemicals related to respiratory diseases, whereas other ones such as nervous, urinary, and so forth do not seem to be driving these results. And these are in line with our results, seeing that stacker emissions are decreasing, greenhouse gas emissions are reducing, and clearly it's also related to respiratory diseases as well. Now, we also consider the reduction or the improvement of air quality around these plants. So what we do is we link our plants to a 1 mile radius around them and try looking at air quality monitors around these plants to measure, are there actual real improvements in the air quality around these plants? And again, you find a reduction in ozone, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matters as well. So it also gives us confidence indeed that there are improvements that are happening in the local economy as well. So the third way that we want to consider the effects on the local economy is thinking about the intensity of pollution. So all pollution is not made equal. So it's important to consider the toxicity of the chemical that's being released, the dosage, how much is actually being released, and also the affected population. If you're in New York versus North Dakota, it's going to have two different effects on kind of the affected population. So what we do is use the EPA's risk screening environmental indicator to come up with a score about the intensity of pollution that's being reduced. And so we aggregate at the census block group level. And what you find over here is that there's large heterogeneity across the United States. There's a large dispersion in terms of where these reductions are coming from and also the levels of reductions. And when we consider the reduction in intensity of pollution, we find, while less statistically precise, and also a decrease in intent of total toxic releases in intensity of pollution. When we start decomposing these results, we find they're coming from reduction in toxic concentrations, the number of chemicals that are being released, and also the number of releases. Now, when we're trying to interpret this, we take a step back. We wonder, well, where are these investors? Well, we know New York City. This is for the New York City pension system is primarily driving this activist campaign. But it's clear to see that a lot of these benefits are accruing to individuals that are not located in the city. So it seems like these externalities are clearly, being driven by investors from New York, but not necessarily internalized by them, which I thought was an interesting way of thinking about it. Now, the last part you want to think about is, how are firms actually achieving these improvements? So to do this, the first way that we thought about is, well, let's look at their anecdotal evidence. And so we read through all their sustainability reports to see, what are they saying? How are they actually improving this? And so you see, for example, in Chevron, you see they're reducing their natural gas flaring and venting and the resulting greenhouse gas. So it gives us a hint of where this is coming from. To get a little bit more background on this, I'm based out of Houston, so there's a lot of oil and gas companies here. I went for drinks with someone from an investor relations at a very large oil and gas company. And I said, how are you guys doing this? And why are you guys doing this? And so he tried to explain that first point, saying that we can do well by doing good. If we are able to better plan and understand our demand for natural gas in our pipelines, we don't have to unnecessarily vent and burn off fuel. We can actually deliver it and make a profit from selling our fuels. And so it's just preventative and putting effort towards this. I said, okay, well, let's see what's happening in the data. So we approach this question in two ways. The first way is we use the EPA's waste management hierarchy. This is akin to a pecking order in terms of the best ways of reducing waste. And so the most productive or most preferred way of doing this is reducing waste actually being produced. So waste created through production is probably the most effective way of reducing your waste, whereas recycling, energy recovery, treatment, disposal are less effective. While it may be more appealing to say we're increasing our recycling, just reducing our total toxic waste is the most impactful way of doing this. So the question is, are firms actually doing that? So we decompose into high and low impactful sources of reductions, and we find primarily the reductions in waste are coming from the reduction in waste coming from production. Thanks, Tony. So this is at least gives us first evidence that these firms are clearly making efforts to reduce their waste rather than giving lip service and doing other things such as recycling and treatment work. And we have to remember that these are, what we're studying are like the 3 years after, or 4 years after the targeting of these firms. And so we're trying to consider the short run initiatives, at least, that these firms can undertake. What can they do in the immediate term to actually bring changes? So what we do is we study the pollution prevention data from the EPA, and we look at new initiatives that each of these plants that are undertaken by these plants. What we find here is that these plants are achieving these improvements by increasing operational efficiency, primarily coming from improved inventory control and preventative efforts such as prevention and leaks. So it seems like primarily these results are coming from increased efforts from prevention, also inventory controls. At least that's what the data suggests also as well. Now, remember, these are short-term changes. The question is, what are some of the financial impacts that these might have? So on one hand, we saw from the previous presentation that in previous literature we've seen activism is typically associated with disciplining firms and may increase operational efficiency of firms. But at the same time, you imagine that a firm might have to make large capital expenditures to improve or reduce their environmental impact. And maybe the benefits aren't going to be realized over the next 3, 4, 5, 7 years. Maybe you'll have reduced levels of lawsuits coming to them, and these won't be realized immediately. So it's unclear kind of how this is going to affect the financial performance of a firm. So what we do is we study 3 measures: the return on assets, profitability, and the bankruptcy risk as measured by an Alt-Z score. We find, while weak, both like small and less precise decreases in performance. And I would caution in terms of the interpretation. It could be that these are the benefits are going to take some time to actually be realized, but at least this is the evidence that we are able to uncover, at least in the short run, from these short run changes that these firms are, how they're responding and kind of the results that we see. Now, the second question that would be raised is, how are investors perceiving these changes? So as pointed out earlier, there might be a trade-off between investors that believe that these are going to be expensive outlays, and it might be coming at the expense of shareholder wealth. Or on the other hand, these could be really beneficial and provide great oversight to these firms. And so it's curious, it's an empirical question: what are the results of the targeting by the BAP? So what we do is we look at firms that are targeted particularly for their environmental mandate, and we find, again, less statistically precise, but positive stock reactions within the 3, 7, and 11-day windows around the actual targeting. So these results are in line with Bhandari and Peter Iliev's forthcoming GFQA paper as well. It seems like we're focusing primarily on the environmental firms that are being targeted, but they're roughly in line. Now, it's a question: is it coming from proxy access proposals being proposed to these firms, or their environmental mandate themselves? It's a little hard to disentangle the two, but it seems like in part some of the positive results are coming from targeting for environmental impact. Now, we do several, we test alternative explanations, we do multiple robustness tests, and just because of the format here, I'm just going to go through a couple of them. One important one that we considered was, well, are the results driven by spillover effects? So remember, the Boardroom Accountability Project targeted portfolio companies for 3 reasons: either excess CEO pay, or diversity, or their environmental impact. And so what we do is we look at the other sustainability campaigns, the other mandates, and see, are these firms also responding along their environmental dimension? You find no result here. You find that these firms that are also being targeted by the BAP, but not for their environmental mandate, are not responding. So it seems that at least the firms are responding to the specific mandates that are being put forward by the BAP. So that's an important result that we thought is important to kind of highlight. The second point that we were worried about is, well, is it coming from the particular Boardroom Accountability Project, or is it coming from being targeted for proxy access? So what we do over here is we also look at for other firms that were also targeted for proxy access, but were unrelated to the environment. And again, we find no result, that it's not necessarily proxy access proposals that are being put forward to the firms that are driving these results. This merely acts as a tool for the Boardroom Accountability Project to exert pressure on these boards to make improvements. The final thing that we also look at here is looking at offshoring. And so we limit our analysis to utility firms as well, and where it's harder for them to substitute to internationally or offsite. And again, we find similar results as well. And the last part that we want to study was a point that was brought up by Matt was, are these results specific to the Boardroom Accountability Project, or are they, more broad? And can we say something a little bit bigger than just studying this particular campaign? So what we do is we look at other firms that were targeted for their environmental impact by activists and that were directly targeted to improve. And again, when we look at the total toxic releases from these direct campaigns, we also see an improvement in their total toxic releases at the plant level. So again, these results mirror our baseline results and also provide further confidence that it seems that
Seems like he's cut out. Is
corporate
that?
environmental behavior.
Oh, yeah. It looks like the last like 40 seconds just kind of cut out. So if you go back one slide and then repeat, that'd be fine. We'll extend the time.
Okay, cool. Did it cut out from here?
Yes, you were on external validity.
Okay.
Okay, great.
So, I see a whole bunch of messages coming through. All right. So, yeah. So the main point that I was trying to highlight here is that we looked at other firms that were also being targeted for environmental activism outside of the Boardroom Accountability Project, and we also find similar results that firms seem to be improving their total toxic releases, and these results are similar to our baseline results that we find through the Boardroom Accountability Project. Can you guys still hear me? Okay, great. And to really summarize this, well, what we find here is that the previous literature focused on social responsible investing primarily through divestment campaigns. Yet in this paper, we show that investors are able to target firms particularly to improve their environmental impact, and it seems that firms are responding by changing their corporate environmental behaviors. We see that there's a reduction in total toxic releases, stack air emissions. Those are related to cancer-causing pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions, air quality monitors, all kind of real important effects. We find these effects really materializing the local economies around these plants. And it seems like it gives an interesting channel where investors are able to delegate their pro-social preferences onto these firms to maximize their total value that they generate. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity and look forward to reopening Slack and getting everyone's feedback.